Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome everybody to day 2 of our conference, Jews and the Left. I'm Jonathan Brent, Executive Director of the YIVO Institute. And I know that some of you are here for the first time. Some of you were here yesterday as well. We have a very diverse group of people speaking, and the discussion and debate was intense yesterday, and I expect the same for today. We're getting off on the right track with Jews and communism, that's for sure. But before we start with our first panel, I do want to make a couple of announcements. The first is that there is an exhibition on the second floor mezzanine that I urge you all to go and see. It is a wonderful collection of materials from the Jewish left-wing press in America and elsewhere in the 30s and 40s, and I think you will see things that will really surprise, if not intimidate you. We have a display in the Great Hall of some of the earliest Yiddish editions of the Communist Manifesto. Those of you who read Yiddish, you will note when you see them that it's not called the Communist Manifesto. It's called the Manifesto of the Communist Party, which is something to ponder. And these are the earliest editions that were made of this translation. There is a background reader of materials that I hope you all have, materials about the left and the history of Jewish engagement with communism and other aspects of the left, Bund, and so forth. If you don't have it, please be sure to see a YIVO staff member and get a copy of it. It's free. I urge you all to check out the materials about YIVO in the Great Hall and to consider becoming a member of YIVO if you aren't already. In particular, I want to welcome guests from very far away, from Lithuania and also from Chile, who are here with us today. And I am grateful for all of you showing up on this Monday morning. I can't let this occasion, however, go by without once again thanking Jack Jacobs for his role in organizing this conference, being the head of the steering committee, and I want to thank again the steering committee, the individuals of which are in your program, so I won't go over all of that again, but Jack in particular did incredible work in helping and in fact taking the lead in conceptualizing how this conference was going to work and making it the kind of program that YIVO wishes to replicate for the future. One that merges academic standards with general interest. And this is a role that the YIVO Institute can and should play in engaging issues of the Jewish world in today's world, engaging issues of Jewish culture with general culture, whether that general culture is Russian, Polish, German, French, or American today. We have a conference planned for next year, which I urge you to consider coming to. It should also be quite interesting on the resurgence of Stalinism and Nazism in Europe and Eastern Europe today. It's a huge subject, very poorly reported in the American press. It has deep implications for the future of Eastern Europe and Russia, and we are going to have an international conference on this subject about a year from now. I want also to thank Suzanne Leon for her unbelievable work as the Assistant Director of the YIVO Institute in making this conference possible, and her wonderful very small but highly disciplined and committed staff in producing all of the materials that you see for today and organizing the breakfast and so on and so forth. That said, we shall move on to communism. And so at the moment, I want to introduce Marcy Shore, who will be the chair of the panel and moderator of it. Thank you.
Welcome, everybody, to our panel on Jews and communism in the 20th century, one of my favorite topics. I won't say anything else because I want to get started, so let me introduce very briefly our first panelist. There's further information about him and all the other panelists in your program, so I won't say anything at length. I will just say that it is a great pleasure to introduce Harvey Clair, who is professor of history and politics at Emory University and the author most recently of a book with the very exciting title, Spies: The Rise and Fall of the KGB in America. And he is going to be talking about Jews and the Communist Party of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, and good morning. Few topics have been as sensitive in the American Jewish community as the seemingly large number of Jews in such radical or revolutionary groups as the Communist Party of the United States. The reason is not hard to fathom. For many years, anti-Semites of all varieties have linked Jews with Bolshevism or communism. Shortly after the Russian Revolution, a magazine published in Brooklyn entitled The Anti-Bolshevist charged that, quote, "The Bolshevik was a Jew who uses socialism, anarchy, and internationalism for the sole purpose of getting possession of the Christian's wealth and to exploit the Christian toiler. The Russian government is a government of the Jews, by Jews, and for the Jews," end quote. Karl Marx, of course, was Jewish, albeit baptized, and such prominent leaders of the Russian Revolution as Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev were also. Invariably and incorrectly, anti-Semites tossed in Lenin as well. Bad enough for American Jews that so many Russian Jews were communists, but far worse that so many revolutionaries seeking to overthrow the democratic government of the United States had Jewish origins. To many Americans, radicalism was a foreign import. Andrew Carnegie once labeled radicals as, quote, "a parcel of foreign cranks whose communistic ideas were the natural outgrowth of unjust laws of their native land," end quote. That so many American Jews had family origins in the old Russian Empire meant that the identification of Jews with Russian communism called into question their own patriotism. Even the Communist Party of the United States was sensitive about its image as a Jewish-dominated organization. A study I conducted many years ago showed that it took Jews considerably longer to work their way up the party ladder to the Central Committee of the American Communist Party than non-Jews. And the reason, I think, was that the Communist Party was anxious to present a less Jewish face to the country. In 1929, the New York Young Communist League boasted of the advances it had made, noting, quote, The results are also good in national composition, the majority of the new recruits being young Americans and not Jewish," end quote. At times, other groups in the Communist Party of the United States complained about an outsized Jewish presence. During the 1930s, when the various ethnic fraternal orders controlled by the Communist Party were consolidated into the International Workers' Order, several of the Eastern European groups grumbled about losing their autonomy and being controlled by the Jews, the largest of the groups. Harold Cruz, a black former communist, wrote a book praised by many on the American left in the 1960s, The Crisis of the Negro Intellectual. And in that book, Cruz railed against what he called Jewish dominance of the Communist Party and complained that Jewish communist intellectuals had brainwashed their black counterparts. While pretending to be universalists, they were actually Jewish chauvinists who had somehow persuaded the Communist Party to, quote, take up the anti-Hitler crusade in the late 1930s, end quote, but at the same time vehemently opposed black nationalism. Many of the leading Jewish cadres of the Communist Party changed their names to present a more American image. Israel Regenstrief became John Gates. Gil Greenberg became Gil Green. Jacob Liebstein became Jay Lovestone. Saul Auerbach became James Allen. Now, non-Jewish ethnic communists also changed their names. Famously, Arvo Holberg became Gus Hall, and Stefan Messerach became Steve Nelson. But my impression is that the practice was far more common among Jews. One important clue to the attraction of the Communist Party to some American Jews, I think, does emerge from this phenomenon of changing names. Oddly enough, the Communist Party was a route to Americanization for some Jews. In the party, young immigrants and the children of immigrants found a way out of their ethnic ghettos. The party was a bridge to the larger American culture, a place where they met and mingled with other Americans. While the Jewish federation of the party, like the other ethnic language groups, conducted its business in Yiddish and was quite insular, younger, more Americanized Jews wanted to be in the more Americanized sector of the Communist Party. If a young communist wanted a future career in the Communist Party, he or she got out of language work as quickly as possible. As J. Peters, born Sander Goldberger, did when he moved in 1929 from the Hungarian Federation, where, by the way, he concealed his Jewish identity, into the broader Communist Party. Peters, like many of his comrades, avoided any identification as Jewish. The Jewish role in the Communist Party varied considerably over time. When the Communist movement was founded in 1919, Jews did not play a major role. Only two of the most prominent left-wing leaders, Gregory Weinstein and Nicholas Auerwitsch, were Jewish, and neither one played a significant role in the Communist Party after its formation. They both returned to Russia. The most prominent figures in the early communist movement, Louis Freina, John Reed, Charles Ruthenberg, James Cannon, Alfred Wagenknecht, and James Larkin, were not Jewish. Most of the Jews who emerged into the party leadership in the 1920s, Ben Gitlow, Bertram Wolfe, J. Lovestone, William Weinstein, Alexander Biddleman, were younger and far less well known, or not known at all, in the Jewish socialist community, and very few of them identified themselves as Jewish in any way. A split in the Jewish Federation of the Socialist Party in 1921 brought more Jews into the communist movement, including such prominent figures as J.B. Salutsky, Mosiah Olgin, and Jacob Mindel. While many of the young Jews who had joined in 1919 moved into second-tier leadership positions in the mid-1920s, only one, J. Lovestone, ever became the leader of the Communist Party. Ousted by Stalin himself in 1929, Lovestone was the first and last Jew to head the party. Between 1921 and 1961, Jews made up approximately 1/3 of the membership of the party's Central Committee. During that period, about 1/2 of all foreign-born members of the Central Committee were Jewish. But for much of the 1920s, Jews, while making up a substantial portion of the mid-level leadership of the party, were not the largest ethnic bloc in it. As late as 1925, about 50% of American communists were Finns, and Yugoslavs and Bulgarians made up another quarter. About 15% of the party was Jewish in that decade. Jewish influence and visibility, however, was far higher than their numbers. Only about 10% of the Communist Party in the mid-20s was English-speaking, and a significant percentage of those who spoke English were Jewish. For all their numbers, the Finns, concentrated in the upper Midwest, played a minimal role in party life and tended to be scorned by other communists as hicks. Jews, on the other hand, were concentrated in New York, Philadelphia, Chicago, and other major cities. They had a significant base in the garment unions, one of the very few industries where communists had established a foothold in the labor movement. And their newspaper, the Freiheit, had a larger circulation than the Daily Worker. In the 1920s, about 22,000 to perhaps 17,000. To be sure, there were substantial defections by Jews from the communist movement. Both the Trotskyists and the Lovestonites, expelled in the late 1920s, were disproportionately Jewish. Virtually all of Lovestone's followers, Bertram Wolfe, Ben Gitlow, Will Herberg, Charles Zimmerman, were Jewish. Martin Aburn, Max Shachtman, Al Glotzer, and numerous other Trotskyists were also of Jewish origin. And many rank-and-file communists found it hard to swallow party support for anti-Jewish riots in Palestine in 1929. The Jewish percentage of the party surged in the 1930s. One reason was that the language federations became far less significant. A dispute within the Finnish Federation over whether the party would control the cooperative movement that the Red Finns had built led to a mass exodus of Finns. But under the impact of the Depression and the rise of Hitler, a large number of native-born Jews, many of them graduating from college with little prospect of employment or facing discrimination in hiring, joined the party. Particularly after 1935, when the party abandoned its ultra-revolutionary third period line, which had foreclosed cooperation with other left-wing groups and declared such social fascists as Norman Thomas more dangerous to workers than the Nazis, party membership soared, reaching 90,000 by 1939. Communists derived enormous prestige in the Jewish community as the most vigorous and militant enemies of fascism, symbolized by their sponsorship of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade fighting on the side of the Loyalists in the Spanish Civil War. Of some 3,000 Americans who went to Spain to fight, at least a third were Jewish. During the Popular Front, the party toned down the assimilationism and atheism that had marked the Third Period. Just as it made appeals to Catholics, it courted Jews. After 1935, Jewish holidays, given a secular content, were incorporated into the curriculum of the IWO's schools. When communists like Israel Amter ran for public office in New York, the party emphasized his Jewish ties. Jack Stachel, a party functionary, announced, quote, "A good communist can also be a good Jew, loyal to his people," end quote. Mosiah Olgin, a one-time Bund leader who had joined the communists in 1921, explained in 1938 that the party's opposition to Zionism had led it to forget, quote, that the craving, the desire for nationhood is not in itself reactionary, end quote. Although there are no exact figures, Jews might have comprised about 40% of the party's membership just before the Nazi-Soviet pact. The Jewish People's Fraternal Order, created to compete with the Workmen's Circle, was the largest ethnic group in the International Workers' Order. The only union, led by an avowed communist, was the largely Jewish Furriers Union, whose fiery president was Ben Gold. Other unions where communist influence was considerable, like the Distributive Workers, the American Federation of Teachers, United Public Workers, and Federation of Architects, Engineers, and Technicians, were largely Jewish and concentrated in New York. The radical student movement of the 1930s was strongest on campuses with large numbers of Jewish students, CCNY, Columbia, NYU, and a large percentage of its leaders were Jewish. In a mock presidential election in 1936, at City College, communist candidate Earl Browder got 25% of the vote. He didn't get that in the general election. The Nazi-Soviet pact was a disaster for the Communist Party, particularly among Jews. The party itself admitted that its membership had dropped by 15% after the pact, but my analysis is that the real losses probably reached about 40%, since party membership in April 1942 had fallen to less than 50,000. Although the World War II alliance with the Soviet Union briefly refurbished the party's image, following the war, it began a long, steady decline into irrelevance. A good picture of the party's support among Jews came during the Henry Wallace campaign of 1948. The party had pushed him to run on a third-party ticket, exerted significant control of the Progressive Party, and urged its union assets to support Wallace, even at the cost of alienating its allies in the labor movement. 1/3 of Wallace's vote came from Jews. Only 2% of non-Jews supported him, compared to about 10% of Jews. It was after World War II, when the party was in steep decline, that it appeared to the public even more Jewish. 11 of the top leaders of the party were tried under the Smith Act in 1948. 5 of them were Jewish. 10 of the 15 defendants in the so-called second string New York Smith Act trial were Jews, as were 7 of the 14 California defendants. The House Committee on Un-American Activities hearings on communism in Hollywood featured a large number of Jews. 7 of the Hollywood 10 were Jewish, as were many of the witnesses that followed them. It was front-page news when actors like Edward G. Robinson, Lee J. Cobb, John Garfield, and Zero Mostel either took the Fifth Amendment or testified about their pasts. Anti-Semites, like Congressman John Rankin of Mississippi, thoughtfully supplied the press with the real names of such miscreants. Eddie Cantor, Edward Iskowitz. Robinson was Emanuel Goldenberg. Danny Kaye, David Kaminsky, Melvin Douglas, Melvin Hesselberg. Rankin was a vile anti-Semite, but his effusions, he once explained on the floor of the House of Representatives that communism was older than Christianity. It had persecuted the Savior and gambled for his garments at the foot of the cross, remained on the fringe. Perhaps most disturbing and frightening to many American Jews were the issues surrounding Soviet espionage. Many of the people named as Soviet spies were Jewish, including Harry Dexter White, Nathan Silvermaster, George Silverman. I could go on and on. About 40% of the people that we now know to have been Soviet spies were of Jewish origin. Two of the highest profile espionage prosecutions featured Jewish defendants, Judith Kaplan and Morton Sobel, Ethel, and Julius Rosenberg. Yet, what is most remarkable is the anti-Semitism that might have been expected and that many in the Jewish community feared from revelations that at the height of the Cold War, a substantial number of those Americans who had spied for the Soviet Union were Jewish, never developed. Even though a number of the defenders of the Rosenbergs tried to argue that they were being persecuted because they were Jewish. Joseph McCarthy, who was not averse to demagoguery, refrained from playing the anti-Semitic card, even though, unlike in Czechoslovakia, there were real spies in America who happened to be disproportionately Jewish. It was the communist left, not the American right, that cynically manipulated anti-Semitic themes in the 1950s. If legal attacks on the party and the emerging Cold War were not enough to drive most party members, including Jews, to desert it, the revelations of Soviet anti-Semitism, including the murder of Yiddish writers, the brutal crushing of the Hungarian Revolution, and Khrushchev's secret speech revealing Stalin's crimes completed the job. Such Jewish communists as John Gates, George Charney, Sid Stein, and Max Weiss led a futile effort to reform the Communist Party and then resigned in the late 1950s when that effort failed. By 1960, party membership had fallen to 3,000 or less. A core of old Jewish members from the garment unions or centered around the Freiheit and Jewish life remained loyal, although subsequent purges after the 1967 and 1973 Mideast wars claimed even such prominent longtime Jewish party members as Paul Novick, longtime editor of the Freiheit, and Morris Shappies of Jewish Life, later Jewish Currents. Jews played a disproportionate role in the Communist Party of the United States and a disproportionate role in defecting from the Communist Party of the United States. And of course, it's also worth recalling that only a small fraction of American Jews were ever members or sympathizers of the Communist Party. At the height, the party had less than 100,000 members. If 40% were Jewish, that suggests 40,000 Jewish communists and certainly a larger number of sympathizers. In the American Jewish community, again, that's a relatively small number. Despite its occasional claims to defend Jewish interests, the Communist Party of the United States at all times in its history placed the interests of the Soviet state above all other considerations. To be a Jewish communist meant approving the Arab slaughter of Jews in Palestine in 1929, an alliance with Adolf Hitler from 1939 to 1941, approval of anti-Semitic purges in Eastern Europe in the 1940s, the murder of luminaries of Yiddish culture, the Doctor's Plot, and the attacks on rootless cosmopolitans in the Soviet Union, to say nothing about the decades-long repression of Jewish refuseniks in that country. Jewish communists had and have a lot to apologize for. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So our next panelist is Tony Michels, who is Associate Professor of American Jewish History at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. He is the author of a book titled A Fire in Their Hearts, Yiddish Socialist in New York. And he will be talking to us today about something he calls the dynamics of disillusionment, communism, anti-communism, and American Jews.
Marcy. My comments complement in certain ways Professor Klehr's. You're going to hear a paragraph that covers almost the exact same information that you just heard that was purely accidental. But it's good. There's nothing to be lost by reinforcing a good point. Communism, and by extension anti-communism in the United States, cannot be understood apart from the Jews. From the Communist Party's establishment in 1919-1920 to its collapse in 1956, Jews joined the party in numbers far out of proportion to their percentage in the overall American population, as we heard, and you're going to hear a little more about that. During the first decade of its existence, when the Communist Party amounted to little more than a sect, Jews provided a significant base of support. During the mid-20s, the Communist Party's Yiddish-speaking section claimed around 2,000 members, or 10% of its overall membership, and more Jews joined the English-speaking, Russian-speaking, Hungarian-speaking, Polish-speaking, and German-speaking sections, so we don't know how many. In certain cities, Jews comprised a clear majority of party membership, as high as 90% in Los Angeles in 1929, according to one report by a communist activist. Yet membership figures tell only part of the story. The scope of Jewish involvement with communism extended well beyond party branches. Communists built a wide network of summer camps, schools, cultural societies, theater groups, choirs, orchestras, youth groups, and even a housing cooperative in the Bronx, all of which combined encompass tens of thousands of Communist Party members, sympathizers, and their families. Communists also won a strong following among Jewish workers in the needle trades, especially in the Furriers Union and the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, which the communists almost succeed in capturing control of in the mid-1920s. In other words, long before the heyday of American communism during the 1930s and 1940s, communism already enjoyed a popular following among Jews, specifically Yiddish-speaking immigrant Jews. Communism's attraction to immigrant Jews was extraordinary when viewed within the context of the conservative 1920s. In a decade characterized by isolationism, nativism, and labor retrenchment, communists made little headway among workers of other religious, racial, or ethnic groups. Finnish immigrants provide a useful point of contrast. Finns joined the communist movement with no less alacrity than the Jews. However, the small size of the Finnish immigrant population, about 250,000 compared to more than 2 million Jews, and its location, the Finnish population's location in rural areas of the upper Midwest, limited the Finns' political significance. By contrast, 2/3 of American Jews lived in 3 cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, and above all New York City, where Jews numbered 1.75 million, or almost 30% of Gotham's population as of 1917. In addition, Jews dominated New York's ready-made clothing industry, the largest segment of the city's manufacturing sector, and controlled its socialist-led trade unions. Their large numbers, concentration in major cities, and predominance in a key industry meant that Jews occupied strategic economic and geographic positions, which served to magnify their already significant presence in the communist movement, indeed on the American left as a whole. Another unique feature of Jewish involvement with communism was its continuation across generations. Whereas Finnish communists proved largely unable to pass their political loyalties down to the second-generation Finnish Americans, American-born Jews gravitated to communism in disproportionate numbers during the 1930s and 1940s. Jews made up a majority of party members in New York County, which was home to the largest number of communists in the United States. Probably 50% of the party's cultural apparatus, its publications, Writers and Artists Association, so on, was made up of Jews, and between 32 and 45% of the party's Central Committee between 1921 and 1950 were Jews. What attracted so many Jews, not a majority of them, of course, but a significant minority, to communism? The answer depends on which Jews one has in mind. Two types of Jews could be found in the communist movement, each with fundamentally different perspectives on Jewish identity. One type, and I'm merely describing a type, the reality was messier. One type conformed more or less to Isaac Deutscher's category of the non-Jewish Jew, that is, a person who wished to escape his or her Jewish roots in favor of a universalistic identity and commitments. This type of universalistic or internationalistic or cosmopolitan Jew dismissed Jewish identity as irrelevant at best and a burden at worst that needed to be transcended, forgotten, or rejected. For such non-Jewish Jews, communism offered an exit visa, to quote the sociologist Zygmunt Bauman, from the Jewish people toward a larger and loftier human community. The second type of communist Jew is less well known because its history cannot fully be assessed without the Yiddish language. This is the self-identified Jewish communist, who is Jewish not merely by birth, but also by affirmation. Jewish communists arrived at communism for considerably different reasons than those of the non-Jewish Jews. Like all Gentile comrades, Jewish communists hailed the Bolshevik Revolution as the greatest event in human history and celebrated Soviet Russia as the world's first workers' republic. Yet they also had additional, specifically Jewish reasons to embrace communism. Jewish communists believed that the Bolshevik government provided sweeping solutions to urgent Jewish problems, starting with the very survival of the Jewish people. The mass slaughter of Jews by white forces during the Russian Civil War convinced many immigrants, and not just communists, in the United States, that the Bolsheviks' triumph was an existential necessity. Immigrant Jews were also greatly encouraged by the fact that Bolsheviks outlawed anti-Semitism, granted national rights to Jews, and embarked on a full-scale reconstruction of the social, economic, and cultural life of Russian Jewry. Thus, Jewish communists, as well as many of those who were not communists, connected the survival and well-being of the Jewish people to Soviet Russia. Turning to domestic issues, Jewish communists considered the Communist Party in America a force for reinvigorating Yiddish culture, not to mention American socialism and the labor movement as a whole. To put it simply, Jewish communists considered themselves both Jews and revolutionaries and believed the Communist Party in Soviet Russia offered the best way to combine those two commitments. The essence of the history of Jewish communism may be described as the attempt to reconcile ethnic and revolutionary commitments. At times, at certain points, those dual commitments to revolution and the Jewish people diverged. And at certain points in time they converged, at other points they diverged, in accordance with shifting and sometimes contradictory communist policies. This made for a highly fraught relationship between Jews and communism. And it was a relationship rendered all the more intense by the high level of expectation Jews invested in Soviet Russia and the life and death matters at stake, specifically during wartime. Thus, reoccurring cycles of expectation and disappointment, hope and betrayal, illusion and, let's call it, realization, played themselves out over decades. This back and forth dynamic began as early as the 1920s, and I want to focus most of my remarks, the rest of my remarks, on the 20s. As I already discussed briefly, many Jews, and again, not only communists, but large numbers of Jews with various political sympathies, felt tremendous enthusiasm for the Bolshevik Revolution during its early years. The Jewish communist movement grew out of this initial enthusiasm. However, Jewish public opinion began to shift already in the mid-1920s as elements within the Jewish labor movement, specifically anarchists and social democrats, began to criticize the increasingly harsh treatment of political opponents of the Bolshevik regime. Reliable first-hand reports began to arrive in the United States by 1922. Probably the most influential writings in English came from Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman, early enthusiasts of the Bolsheviks who the United States government deported to Russia in 1919. By the time of the Kronstadt Rebellion, they had grown thoroughly disgusted with the Soviet government and indeed left Russia. In the summer of 1922, Berkman published the first detailed account of Kronstadt in English. In 1923 and 1924, Goldman published My Disillusionment in Russia and its sequel, My Further Disillusionment in Russia. In 1925, Berkman published The Bolshevik Myth, based on his diaries from the years between 1919 and 1921. Together, these works argued a simple point. The Bolsheviks had betrayed the revolution by establishing a dictatorship over the proletariat, not of the proletariat. Berkman and Goldman's writings had a powerful effect on Jewish anarchists in the United States, who, although relatively few in number, maintained viable institutions and occupied important positions in the Jewish labor movement. The veteran anarchist journalist, for instance, Shaul Yanovsky, was also the editor of the ILGW's Yiddish and English language weeklies, and it was at the same time editor of the Yiddish weekly Die Freie Arbeiter Stimme. The president of the ILG, Morris Sigman, was also an anarchist. Right? So these were people with some influence. Furthermore, Berkman was determined to bring the issue of Soviet political prisoners into wide public view. In 1924, he convinced, from Europe and through correspondence, he convinced the head of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, to assemble a committee of prominent liberals to address the plight of political prisoners. It was called the International Committee to Protect Political Prisoners, and it was established, it's worth noting, over the objection of a good number of liberals who were loath to criticize what they called the Soviet experiment and provide ammunition to conservative anti-communists. The committee's published report, assembled by Berkman, documented the plight of political prisoners, particularly members of non-communist revolutionary parties, and it can be considered a landmark in the literature of American anti-communism. For their part, Jewish social democrats launched their own effort on behalf of Soviet political prisoners. Their main base of operations was a small organization called the Jewish Socialist Verband, the Yiddish language section of the Socialist Party, or was left of the Socialist Party by the mid-1920s. The Verband published a Yiddish weekly edited by the journalist David Shub, which published a steady stream of criticism of communism in the Soviet government. Shub published prominent European social democrats such as Karl Kautsky, Julius Martov, Emil Vanderbilt, and others, whose writings were largely unavailable to most English readers in America at this point in time. In 1925, the Verband brought the issue of political prisoners to wide public attention by organizing a lecture tour by Raphael Abramovich, a highly respected leader of the Mensheviks, the internationalist wing, the Bund, and the Socialist International. His tour turned into a scandal when communists acting on orders from the Communist International disrupted or attempted to disrupt almost every lecture he gave around the country, and they waged a vicious campaign against him in the communist press. All the while, a violent war raged between communists and socialists and anarchists for control over the ILGWU and other unions. From these battles between 1924 and 1926, an anti-communist alliance took shape, consisting of the Jewish Socialist Verband, the ILGWU, the Yiddish daily Vorwärts, and a new English language weekly named The New Leader, sponsored by the Forward and the ILG. Two distinct communist and anti-communist camps now existed in the Jewish labor movement and the American left as a whole, and this would become a permanent feature of the American left. If communists had reason to believe they could win their contest with social democrats in the mid-1920s, and I think they did have good reason to believe they would come out on top, that hope was lost by the end of 1929 in the wake of a new scandal prompted by the riots in Palestine, which had broken out on an unprecedented scale in August of that year. The communist Yiddish daily Die Morgenfreiheit originally used the word pogrom to describe the violence, implying that the attacks by Arabs on Jews contained an inexcusable anti-Semitic character. However, in response to criticism by party leaders, the editor of the newspaper, Moise Olgin, quickly put forward a different interpretation. The, quote, events in Palestine, he stated, actually amounted to, and I'm quoting again, a mass revolt against imperialist domination. The change of position failed to satisfy Communist Party leaders who viewed it as too soft still on Zionism. Accordingly, Olgin published a declaration which stated in part, I'm quoting, "The establishment of a Jewish country in Palestine is the fig leaf of British imperialism and its land-grabbing aggression in this part of Asia. And the Zionist movement is willing and knowingly lending itself to this mission," end quote. Several days later, in an attempt to stave off further criticism from the Communist Party leadership, Olgin printed an even more strident denunciation of what he called Zionist fascists. A public rally organized by Die Morgenfreiheit for the purpose of denouncing Zionism was a further attempt to establish the newspaper's credibility. Die Morgenfreiheit's position on the violence in Palestine provoked a furious reaction in immigrant Jewish communities around the United States. Every Yiddish newspaper condemned Die Morgenfreiheit. Newspaper vendors in New York City refused to handle the newspaper for 5 days or more. Businesses stopped purchasing advertisements. The communist-controlled Furriers Union suffered a large-scale defection of members that almost destroyed the union. In Chicago, a riot almost broke out, actually did break out, according to the Daily Worker, in front of the Freiheit's local office. In Cleveland, Jewish communists could not find a hall willing to rent to them. The Yiddish Writers Union expelled the Morgenfreiheit staff members, and a host of acclaimed Yiddish poets and writers resigned from the newspaper. And in New York, a panel of distinguished Yiddish scholars presided over a mock trial in front of 2,500 people, which found Olgin and his colleagues guilty of, quote, willfully and maliciously falsifying the news from Palestine. The large-scale backlash almost bankrupted the Yiddish Daily. The scandal surrounding Die Morgenfreiheit in 1929 marked an ironic reversal. 10 years earlier, the slaughter of innocent Jews during the Russian Civil War had impelled many Jews, including the editor of the Freiheit himself, toward a sympathetic view of the Bolsheviks. In 1929, however, Soviet orders pressured Olgin and his colleagues to justify violence against Jews in Palestine. A similar dynamic would repeat itself over the following decades. At certain moments, the Soviet Union appeared as protectors of the Jews. This held true during the Second World War and Israel's war for independence, when the Soviet Union briefly reversed its traditional anti-Zionist position and vigorously supported the establishment of the State of Israel. In the face of systematic extermination by Nazi Germany during the early 1940s and Arab military efforts to abort the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, many thousands of Jews viewed the Soviet Union as a heroic defender of their people. And yet, in other instances, such as the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact, Stalin's suppression of Yiddish culture, and the party's anti-Semitic policies in the late Stalin period, the Soviet Union betrayed Jewish hopes and interests. The contradictory role played by the Soviet Union as rescuer of Jews at certain points and their persecutor at others framed the history of Jewish communists in the United States. Of course, disillusionment with communism was hardly unique to the Jews. But as I've tried to suggest, Jews experienced this disillusionment acutely, especially acutely, because of their stake in the outcome of the revolution and direct personal ties to Soviet Russia. Furthermore, immigrant Jews spearheaded a particular kind of anti-communism, otherwise largely unfamiliar to American politics, especially in the 1920s, which was an anti-communism mounted in the name of socialism, not opposed to it. Historians have largely failed to appreciate or even consider seriously this kind of left-wing communism, tending to view it within a narrow frame of sectarian struggles and polemics between intellectuals grouped around small magazines, who, it is often claimed, exaggerated communism's sins all out of proportion to its actual dangers. In the words of an author of a monumental study of McCarthyism, the Communist Party, quote, for all its flaws, was neither strong nor dangerous, end quote. This contention simply does not apply to the immigrant Jewish world, where much was at stake in communism's success or failure. Communists made a serious bid for control over powerful labor unions with memberships totaling more than 200,000 people. In Soviet Russia, communists controlled the fate of millions of people, including tens of thousands of revolutionaries whose lives were threatened by the Bolshevik regime. For immigrant Jews who had direct ties to comrades, friends, and family in their country of origin, what communism did in Russia mattered almost as much as their actions in the United States. The battles waged between pro-communists and anti-communists, and this is by way of conclusion, shaped the politics of American Jews, and by extension, the politics of the American left for the better part of the 20th century, with resonances and legacies that continue to this day. Thank you.
Thank you. It is now my pleasure to introduce our third panelist, Antonia Polanski, who is Professor of Holocaust Studies at Brandeis University and the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. He is, among many other things, the editor of Polin, and for decades now, the inspiration behind an extraordinarily developed Polish-Jewish dialogue at this point. And he is the author, most recently, of a mammoth and breathtakingly comprehensive 3-volume history of the Jews in Poland and Russia. He is going to talk to us today about Jews and communism in Poland and Russia. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. What I want to do today is to examine how prominent was the presence of Jews in the government and security apparatus of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of Poland, and how this participation should be evaluated. The position of the Bolsheviks on the, in quotation marks, Jewish question is well known. National issues were seen by them as instrumental. They were to be judged on how they advanced the interest of the world revolution and the Soviet state. Where national groups were supported, this was a tactical alliance, like the alliance with the peasantry. The ultimate goal was the creation of a new socialist man who would be above petty nationalist divisions and a single world socialist state. All those responsible for Jewish policy within the Bolshevik Party sought this final goal. The only difference between them was their view on how long Jewish separateness could be tolerated. I haven't got time in this presentation to discuss the attempt to create a socialist Jewish culture based on a Sovietized version of Yiddish in the 1920s in particular. The Jews, according to Bolshevik theory, were not a nation. In the course of the Bolsheviks' conflict with the Bund, Lenin had asserted, quote, "The idea of a Jewish nation is essentially totally false and reactionary." This view was confirmed by Stalin's study of the problem, carried out at Lenin's request in 1913. According to this, a nation should have 4 characteristics: a common territory, a common language, a common economic system, and a common culture, which, in his view, the Jews possessed none of these. In the Soviet Union, after the revolution, the Soviets sought to foster the integration of Jews in the new society by abolishing all restrictions on where they could live or what occupations they could pursue. As a result, in the 20 years between the end of the Civil War in 1921 and the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, a major transformation took place within the Jewish population of the country, so that by 1941, The majority of Soviet Jews lived in 6 towns: Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Kharkiv, Odessa, and Minsk. Urbanization, even before 1914, had been accompanied by the adoption of the Russian language, and Russification was frequently associated with the adoption of the values of the Russian intelligentsia, a group deeply at odds with the surrounding society. The adoption of its values inevitably brought with it rejection of what were regarded as Jewish petit bourgeois values, backwardness, provinciality, that seemed to be embodied in the families of those who became Russified in this way. The processes of acculturation and integration were enormously accelerated by the policies of the Bolsheviks. The emigration of over 2 million people from Russia in the aftermath of the revolution, among them some 50,000 Jews, most of them from the educated classes, created a huge gap in skilled personnel and created new opportunities for upwardly mobile Jews. Industrialization and the 5-year plan furthered this process. Some Jews, as in the poster, became workers. 30% of economically active Jews in 1939 were described as industrial workers, but the majority were clerical workers or officials. Jews were particularly strongly represented among the ranks of managers, accountants, technicians, teachers, doctors, cultural workers, professors, agronomists, engineers, and architects. Those Jews who emerged from the Soviet universities in the late 1920s and 1930s constituted a generation devoted both to the ideals of the revolution and to Russian culture as embodied in the traditions of the pre-revolutionary intelligentsia. According to one of them, Mikhail Baitalsky, quote, "While we all prepared ourselves to be agitators and propaganda officials, at the same time, quote, we inherited the moral ideals of all the generations of the Russian revolutionary intelligentsia, its nonconformity, its love of truth, its moral sense." At some level, these two sets of values were at odds with each other. According to David Samuilov, there's a distinction to be made in the two aspects of this generation. Within it, he writes, there were both the Jewish members of the intelligentsia, or at least the material out of which the intelligentsia would be created, and the many thousand-strong detachments of red commissars and party functionaries, dehumanized, raised by the wave, intoxicated by power. And this, of course, inevitably raises my principal question of how many Jews were members of the Communist Party and the ruling bureaucracy. This has been mentioned by a number of people in the course of this conference, and I just remind you that before the revolution, those Jews who adopted a socialist point of view mostly supported the Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, and the Bund. Few were Bolsheviks. Before the revolution, Jews represented about 1,000 of the 23,000 members of the Bolshevik faction. In 1917, the Bund, I remind you, had a membership of around 33,000 people. At the same time, and this has also been mentioned on a few occasions, there were a number of prominent Bolsheviks of Jewish origin, although, of course, they would have denied any connection with the Jewish world, and their names have been mentioned many times: Trotsky, Zinoviev, Kamenev, Sverdlov, Lazar Kaganovich. In the first years after the revolution, Jews formed a significant proportion of the Communist Party, but a minority, a small minority. In 1922, Jews made up 5.2% of the Communist Party. In 1927, 4.3%. This, of course, was a significantly higher proportion than the Jewish proportion of the total population, between 2 and 3%, but it's still a minority within the party. But Jews, although the percentage of the Jews in the party was relatively small, Bolshevik Jews were highly visible, partly because in the former Tsarist Empire, Jews in positions of authority had been so unusual, and partly also because of their prominence in certain areas. Thus, for instance, in April 1917, 10 out of the 24 members of the governing bureau of the Petrograd Soviet were Jews, while at the Bolshevik Central Committee meeting of 23rd October 1917, that's old style, which took the decision to launch an armed insurrection, Bolshevik Revolution, 5 out of the 12 members present were Jews. Not all of them, by the way, voted in favor of this resolution. Jews also played a significant role in the organs of the security apparatus, the CK and its successors, the OGPU and the NKVD. And this was particularly the case during collectivization and in the first five-year plan. In July 1934, Genrich Jagoda, obviously a person of Jewish origin, was appointed People's Commissar for Internal Affairs with control over the regular as well as the secret police. And when the OGPU was transformed into the NKVD, people classed as Jews under paragraph 5 of the internal passport law made up 37 out of the 96 leading cadres of the organization. When Stalin replaced Jagoda in September 1936, he appointed another Jew, the even more zealous and unpleasant Nikolai Yezhov. In January 1937, the 110 top NKVD officials included 42 Jews, 35 Russians, 8 Latvians, and 26 others. However, by now, the role of the Jews in the NKVD was coming to an end, and Yezhov's replacement by Beria, a Georgian like Stalin himself, was followed by a diminution of Jews in leadership positions of the NKVD. I should say at the lower levels of the secret police apparatus, Jews were not that strongly represented. It's really in the leadership levels. On 1st September 1938, Jews still constituted 21.3% of the management cadre, but as of 1st July 1939, they were only 3.9%. Indeed, this is the first stage of the purge of Jews within the Soviet political establishment. And this development probably reflected Stalin's increasing interest in making an arrangement with Hitler. Certainly, Maxim Litvinov, the Soviet foreign minister, and other Jewish diplomats were dismissed on the eve of the conclusion of the German-Soviet non-aggression agreement. Litvinov's successor, Vyacheslav Molotov, was specifically instructed by Stalin, quote, to get rid of the Jews in the Commissariat of External Affairs. Hitler at this time told his associates that in a conversation with Ribbentrop, Stalin had claimed that he was only waiting for the emergence of a sufficiently large stratum of local intelligentsia before removing Jews from the Soviet elite. And this process was exacerbated or accelerated by Stalin's growing suspicion of Jews after the war. In particular, he became obsessed, as relations with the West deteriorated, by the close links which the leadership of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee had established with Jews outside the Soviet Union, especially in the United States, and at the enthusiastic support given by Soviet Jews for the emergence of the State of Israel. As in other purges, Stalin acted on several levels, taking action both against those who were prominent in the Soviet Yiddish cultural establishment and against the larger group of acculturated and Sovietized Jews who still held prominent positions in the Soviet bureaucracy and in a cultural life. The tragic denouement is well known, culminating in the notorious Doctor's plot, and there's no need to rehearse this here. In Poland, after 1944, the regime found itself even more difficult to find reliable cadres and sought them partly among the small surviving Jewish community. Most of the over 300,000 Polish Jews who survived the war, primarily in the Soviet Union, soon left the country. Among the remainder, between 70 and 80,000 in 1951, Polonization proceeded rapidly, and the communist regime, for all its faults, was widely seen as bringing a better future and the only genuine protector of the Jews. The war had certainly strengthened the perceived identification in the country of Jews with communism. But it should be stressed that in their hope that the new regime would remedy the defects of the Polish Second Republic, Jewish supporters of the new order were at one with a significant part of the Polish intelligentsia. In addition, in the civil war conditions of post-war Poland, the Jewish community could expect protection only from the new communist-dominated authorities. Communists of Jewish origin certainly played a significant, Marcy Shore is the great expert on this, role in the new regime. In the political apparatus, they included Jakob Berman, Roman Zambrowski, Hilary Mintz, Jerzy Boresha. And as in the Soviet Union, Jews also played a significant role in the security apparatus of the new regime. among them Anatol Fagin, head of the notorious 10th Department of the Ministry of Public Security, which was responsible for the surveillance of all leading members of the PZPR, the ruling Communist Party, and his deputy, Józef Światło, who of course defected in 1952. At the same time, there was a strong tendency to characterize as Jews any one of whom one disapproved. Thus, in his account of his tenure as American ambassador to Poland, Arthur Bliss Lane, this is I Saw Poland Betrayed, writing presumably under the influence of his Polish contacts, described Stanislaw Radkiewicz, the non-Jewish Minister of Public Security, as, I quote, a good-looking man of Russian Semitic origin with carefully combed, oily black hair and a keen, mobile, aesthetic face. On the basis of an investigation of the official account of the Central Office of the Security Services, produced by Department C of the Ministry of Interior Affairs in 1978, the historian Andrzej Paczkowski carried out an analysis of the ethnic background of those officials who, in the period between 1944 and 56, occupied the position of section head or higher in the headquarters of the security establishment. Of the 447 individuals in the survey, the nationality of 131, 29.6%, was listed as Jewish. As in the case of the NKVD, the number of Jews in the lower ranks of the Polish security services was much smaller. After 1956, Jews, as everybody knows, were to be largely purged from the security apparatus. And even in the period between, and this is a different story, I'd like to have had two papers. The first would be like the first paper we heard this morning, which described the role of Jews in the party. The second would be to describe the role of Jews in opposing communism in Poland, and the role of Jews in the emergence of first the revisionist critique of communism, which brought Gomulka to power, and then of the emergence of the Committee for the Defense of the Workers and of Solidarity. But I can only deal with the first here. As I say, the question that one really has to ask about the role of Jews in the security apparatus in Poland is, why was it that Jews were allowed to hold a considerable number of important posts in the security apparatus in Poland when they had already been removed or were in the process of being removed from such positions in the Soviet Union, as I've described? And at root, this has to be seen as a consequence of Stalin's deep distrust of the communist Polish apparatus, and in particular of what he regarded as the Polish nationalists within the PPR and the PZPR, of which the most important was, of course, Władysław Gomulka, whom Stalin saw as a Soviet Tito. This advancement, or at least putting Jews in these positions, took place at the same time as the purge of Yiddish cultural activists in the Soviet Union and the wider campaign against cosmopolitanism. The retention of Jews was clearly intended by Stalin as a temporary expedient until a larger group of reliable local communists could be trained. Part of the problem of Polish communism was that such a reliable group never actually emerged. Resentment in the party against the position of Jewish communists and Jews in general surfaced in the crisis which brought Gomulka to power, and still more in that of 1968. Let me now try and sum up the significance of what I've been describing. Most of the problems are aroused by those who took an active part in the communist regimes in the Soviet Union and Poland, and indeed elsewhere, although this is not the subject of my presentation. How is one to evaluate their behavior? Some have claimed that those who became communists had totally severed their links with the Jewish world. In a speech in 1917, Shimon Dubnov observed, "Many demagogues have emerged from among us, who have joined the heroes of the street and the prophets of power grabbing. They use Russian pseudonyms because they are ashamed of their Jewish origins, like Trotsky and Zinoviev. But maybe it is their Jewish name which is not genuine, because they have no roots to bind themselves to our people." Now, of course, there is some truth in these observations, but such people are clearly representative of the group which has been often described so far in this conference, the group described by Isaac Deutscher as non-Jewish Jews, and their role in the early history of Soviet Russia and of communist Poland is undeniable. Certainly, the messianism of the Bolsheviks struck a chord with many Jews, as did the slogans of the communist political religion, such as "God is us," The proletariat is the chosen people, which will fulfill its mission and complete history. And the destitute proletariat was nothing, it will be everything. In addition, as other speakers have mentioned, Jews were attracted to revolutionary socialism because of their belief that this would make possible integration, and because also, this hasn't been sufficiently stressed, at least in Eastern Europe, of the widespread Jewish poverty in the area. For anti-Semites, the equation of Jew and Bolshevik merely added to the armory of their arguments. But there are those who have raised seriously the question of why Jews played such large a role in the revolution, and whether Jews as a whole have some responsibility for those of their number who are implicated in the many excesses and crimes of communism since 1917. One of them is Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who in his two-volume study of Russian Jewish relations, Dviestie lat vmestie, called on Jews, on the analogy of the Germans, to apologize for the Jewish role in the mass slaughters which accompanied the establishment and continuation of Bolshevik rule. What is clear is that the crude application of the concept of collective responsibility to so diverse and politically unorganized a group as the Jews of the Tsarist Empire and of Soviet Russia does not facilitate the understanding of complex historical events. Rather, I think one needs to seek to understand the reasons why a section of the Jewish community was attracted to Bolshevism and manifested this allegiance, sometimes in violent forms, and we also need to understand, in the larger context, the complex nature of Jewish acculturation and integration within the Soviet revolutionary state and in post-1944 Poland. Let me conclude with two evaluations of the role of Jews in the revolution. The first is by Vasily Grossman, who in his philosophical novel Forever Flows saw this as the result of the longue durée of Jewish history, and I quote him, "Whence had that powerful flame of fanaticism flared within him, the son of a sad, sly shopkeeper from the shtetl of Fastov, the student in the commercial school who had read the books of the Golden Library and of Louis-Henri Boussinard? Neither he nor his father had any reason to store up within their hearts that hatred of capitalism which was fed in dark coal mines in smoky factories. Who had given him a fighter's soul? Was it the example of Zhelyabov and Kalyaev, or the wisdom of the Communist Manifesto, or the suffering of the impoverished people right beside him? Or was it that the smoldering coals were buried deep within his 1,000-year inheritance, ready to burst into flame, to do battle with Caesar's Roman soldiers, to confront the bonfires of the Spanish Inquisition, to join in the starving frenzy of the Talmudists, to emerge in the shtetl organization for self-defense of during the pogroms? Was it the age-old chain of abuses, the anguish of the Babylonian captivity, the humiliation of the ghetto, or the misery of the Pale of Settlement that had produced and forged that unquenchable thirst that was scorching the soul of the Bolshevik Lev Mekler? Others have been less apologetic. Unlike some other Jewish former communists, the Polish Jewish poet Stanislaw Vygotsky, who emigrated to Israel in 1968, remained true to the ideal of communism while rejecting the practice. In an interview with the Polish weekly Politica in 1990, shortly before his death, characteristically entitled, "I served an evil cause," he observed, "You want to know whether I still believe in something that was once called communism. I believe that one should not live from exploitation, that one should not oppress anyone, that one should not subjugate a foreign land, and that one should not do anything that takes away from people their humanity. That is what communism means to me, and it is in such a communism that I still believe today." Thank you.
Okay, officially speaking, we only have 5 minutes. 15, okay. Which I want to say is not due to the fault of the panelists, all of whom were beautifully, perfectly on time, which almost never happens at conferences. But we got a slightly late start. So we're going to have 15 minutes of questions. I'm going to ask you very, very nicely to please keep them brief and make them questions, not comments, and don't make me try to use the tiny little bit of aggression that's hard for me to come up with right now to cut you off. Just please self-police. That would be great. Okay, great.
Thank you so much to all of the panelists for your talks, which I found really interesting. I do have a question. I'll begin with the question and then explain it, if I may, Marcy. And the question is a question for Harvey, and it's a question that begins with the final line of your talk. And that final line was, Jewish communists had and have a lot to apologize for. Now, it seems to me that one way for us to begin this discussion is precisely by combining the analysis that Antony gave us with your final line. And what I'm thinking of, as I'm confident will be clear to you, is two different things. Number one, there's lots of people who have a lot to apologize for. McCarthyites, amongst others, have a lot to apologize for. Number two, any number of those who you mention who were Jewish communists did in fact apologize in any number of different senses of the term over a long period of time. I'm thinking here amongst people who you mentioned, including Chappies, including Novick, including their descendants today in Jewish Currents and in Kinderland. And so it seems to me that, and this is the question, why focus on the need for Jewish communists to apologize today, which you in fact said, rather than in explaining the dynamic of what it was that attracted Jews to communism in America? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I think there are two different issues, and one is obviously that there is a need to explain what drew Jews to communism. It's quite true that a number of Jews who were in the Communist Party did, in various ways, sometimes more heartfelt and sometimes more measured, apologize. When I made that comment, I didn't mean it in terms of, I don't think that your comment that, Solzhenitsyn was calling on Jews to apologize to Russians. I was referring to communist Jews to apologize to the Jewish community, because I think that their elevation of their loyalty to Stalin and Stalinism and Tony's comments about 1929 are particularly appropriate there. Even in cases where people that remained loyal to the Communist Party apologized later on, for example, during the Popular Front, the apologies were made on behalf of a new Soviet policy. It was not particularly a recognition of that they had made a fundamental mistake in political loyalties, and that's what I was referring to.
Hi. One thing that I don't think merits an apology with the organizing of unemployed councils during the Depression. And I guess you're all familiar with the fact that FDR famously said, "Make me do it," when he was criticized from his left. And among those groups that made him do it were organizations among unemployed workers that were driven originally by communists and later by socialists. I'm just curious about the Jewish role in those organizations. The initial effort was probably Cox's Army, and that was a Catholic priest who drove that. But could you comment on the Jewish role?
No, not specifically on the unemployed councils, other than I'm sure there were a lot of Jews involved.
Yeah, I don't think there was any particularly Jewish role. They were acting as communists. I think it's also worth noting that the Communist Party in its propaganda took credit for pushing the New Deal towards Social Security and unemployment insurance. If you look at the actual debates and arguments in 1934, 1935, when those bills were under discussion, the Communist Party vehemently and angrily opposed unemployment insurance and Social Security as proposed, and the communist bill that was sponsored by a representative from Minnesota, who was a secret member of the Communist Party, demanded that Social Security and unemployment insurance be administered by workers' councils. In other words, the Communist Party position was so far off the radar that, quite frankly, it did more damage to efforts to pass that kind of legislation than assist it.
I heard from the first two speakers the degree of participation of Jews in various organizations, the percentages, even names. I would have liked to hear how representative they were, how relevant they were to shaping the U.S. policies. Because most of the Jews in the States came here to do business, so they were not ideological. That's one thing. Second is for Tony Michels, a little bit of a correction. When you said that there was a change of course of events in when the creation of Israel was of being not as anti-Zionist, the Russians were anti-Zionist all along. What Stalin tried to do was only to use Israel as a relief valve of the pressures mounting, and to create an experiment of communizing Israel. And when he realized there is no such a success, then he really started the real war against the Jews. Thank you.
So the first question: how significant were the communists? In the Jewish community, they were very significant, and I tried to give some indication of that. In the 1920s, the numbers of party members were actually quite small, as both of us indicated. But that's not the best way to measure communist influence, because there were so many sympathizers around the party. In related institutions, in independent organizations, that we're actually talking about a popular movement. And the clearest sign of that, again, was the insurgency that communists led within the major trade unions. I think that was one measure of their influence during the 1920s. And you could trace this. You could look at any number of arenas, organizations, causes between the 20s and the 40s. 50s even, and communists played a large role, for better or for worse. I think to understand that, I think you actually have to correct your presupposition that most immigrants came to make a buck in business. Most immigrants actually had a mix of goals, emotions, attitudes, and they involved making a living, and for a good many of them, trying to make the world and the United States a better place. A good number of communists were businessmen, which might give a sense of the mixed feelings that prevailed even among professed Marxist-Leninists.
I'll just say a few words about Stalin's decision to recognize the State of Israel and also to provide significant both military and personnel assistance in the arms which came from Czechoslovakia and the illegal immigration which was allowed to go to Palestine at this time. You're right that we know a lot more about this now because of the opening of the Soviet archives. I think that there were two factors in Stalin's mind. The one was that this, as was said yesterday, would be a major blow to British imperialism, and Stalin interpreted the situation in the Middle East that the British controlled the Middle East in alliance with feudal powers, and if these feudal powers were undermined, communism would spread. And he also may have hoped, but that's not at all clear how strong these hopes were, that within Jewish Palestine, leftist leftist and pro-Soviet elements would be strong. But it is certainly the case that Stalin's disquiet at the contacts between the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee and the much greater sense of Jewish self-identity which had developed within the Soviet Union as a result of the Second World War was already being manifest in purges of Jews. Khrushchev in Ukraine in 45 and 46 was already diminishing the number of Jewish cadres. So the roots of the subsequent purge, although not its actual scope, were already evident in 1945 and 46.
Morning. My wife's a red diaper baby, which is a whole topic on its own, and her father was in the Lincoln Brigade. He fought in Spain, and in the London Blitz. But just to comment quickly, you know, of course, you know, they came from all around the world to fight fascism. What you think of the brigades might be another issue. And he told her the one language that they communicated in was Yiddish, that there were so many Jews involved. And as an aside, he used to see Spanish women light candles on Friday night who were Catholic women who didn't know why they were doing it, but who did it for generations. But one question I have, which goes with the first questioner, you know, I'm always pointing out to my wife, you know, Stalin, you know, the communists were, you know, apologists for Stalin and authoritarianism and all the bad things. And she recognizes that, but she says the communists, you know, well, she's not going to criticize her father, I'll tell you that, but she says the communists she knew through her father's generation they were really motivated, maybe misguided, but motivated by fighting racism, by fighting for labor rights. They were the ones who actually went in the fields, who went in the factories. And the first question, you know, resonated with me was no one was talking about the reason why so many Jews, who I think were socially conscious people, were motivated to join the Communist Party. It was a religion to them somewhat. They were blinded by the evil, well, the bad things that happened, but these were often personally very good people who really were devoted to the highest causes.
I don't doubt that, and I think you're right. I think one has to also recognize that people had lots of different motives for joining the Communist Party and the Communist movement. To stay in it for any length of time meant that you had to seriously compromise those ideals. Just give one example from the Lincoln Brigade. Milton Wolfe, who was the last commander of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, made all kinds of stirring speeches about anti-fascism and stopping fascism and so on. At the Abraham Lincoln Brigade's, the veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade's 1940 meeting at the time of the Nazi-Soviet Pact, Milton Wolfe gave a stirring speech in which he denounced fascism. Franklin Roosevelt. There was not one word about Adolf Hitler.
I think we have time for one more question.
First, let me comment on the irony of this conference being called the International Conference, or International Conference. Secondly, I'd like to remember with you the way the Jews in the Bronx on Grand Concourse and the high holidays used to march out in the street rather than go to synagogue to show their relation to the Marxist points of view. But what I'd like to know is this. Do you think that the people who were the disaffiliated, disaffected part of the Jewish communist effort, as compared to the people you were also talking about, Mr. Michels, who were the religiously oriented people, do you think that the people who were not religiously oriented, who were trying to march out on the street, were not affected yet by Jewish values? Don't you think that their value system, which resulted in their participation in the Marxist efforts, was based upon a religious background?
I think I failed to clarify something. The Jewish communists I was talking about, the ones who identified themselves as Jews and joined Jewish organizations and so on, were not religious. They were atheists. And the nature of their Jewish identity was based on the roots of it were based on secular and nationalist ideologies. that had been formulated before the Communist Revolution, which held that Jews were a nation and ought to build some sort of national culture in Yiddish. And many Jews in the Communist Party had come from that background and subscribed to that idea, so that religion didn't mean anything to them except maybe something to reject and rebel against.
Okay, we are now going to take a 5-minute break. We will reconvene at 10:45. Please join me in thanking our panelists.